Hello and welcome to another edition of Truth TV. On today's episode, Marxism, Mayhem, and Madness calls from a leading black conservative to stop cowering to Black Lives Matter. Liberty Nation's Jeff Charles is here to discuss what Allen West said and why. A century-long flirtation with Marxism has led to what? LN's Tim Donner joins us for a discussion. And in today's Viewpoint, airbrushing the white Jesus calls to destroy art depicting Jesus as white. Missed the mark. I'll explain why. All this and more on today's edition of Truth TV.
Truth is making a comeback.
This week, prominent black conservative Allen West blasted corporate leaders and the NFL for, quote, cowering to Black Lives Matter. He says they are acquiescing and surrendering to a Marxist mob, which is what BLM is. West also stated that, quote, these people don't have the courage to stand up and say what needs to be said. Liberty Nation's socio-political correspondent Jeff Charles joins us with some insight and background on this increasingly dicey situation. Welcome to Truth TV, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
All right, let's begin by running Allen West's comment, and then I'll let you have the floor.
So what do you make of these athletes, Allen West, and these coaches and these commissioners, all now taking a knee to Black Lives Matter?
Well, again, it's very appalling that you would have these corporations and businesses and you have these sports franchises like the National Football League that are cowering and acquiescing and surrendering to a Marxist mob, which is what Black Lives Matter is. You know, this past week I did a video in response to what Brett Favre said in his comparative analysis that Colin Kaepernick would go down as a hero just the same as Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman was a man who quit the NFL and decided to join the Army, enlist in the Army, become an infantryman, an airborne ranger, and was, sadly killed in a friendly fire incident in combat in Afghanistan. Now, how do you make that comparison to someone like Colin Kaepernick? The only reason why Brett Favre does that, the only reason why someone like Drew Brees apologizes or Roger Goodell gets on his knees, the only reason why you have the head of Chick-fil-A talking about white people need to shine the shoes of black people is because they don't have their courage to stand up and say what needs to be said. They continue to believe that you can appease a mob. The mob will never be happy. And the leader of Black Lives Matter said they will burn the system down. You cannot negotiate and you cannot meet someone like that on an ideological field and believe you can have reasonable discourse.
Okay, Jeff, have at it.
Okay, so I definitely understand what Allen West is saying, and I actually agree. I mean, I will say that the NFL is kind of finds himself in an awkward position here, right? Because either way they go, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they don't allow a lot of the protesting to happen, they alienate half of their audience. If they do the opposite, they lose half of their audience, and that's what happened when the whole thing with Colin Kaepernick really became a focal point in the culture. But I mean, when Allen West talks about Black Lives Matter, I mean, yeah, the national organization is very much a Marxist organization. It has been co-opted by progressives. So it doesn't make any sense to kowtow to them. Now, there is a difference between the national Black Lives Matter organization and then the organizations that you see on the local level. That's where it gets a little bit more complex. But when we're talking about the overall push that the white progressives are really pushing, not black people, then yeah, that is a Marxist organization and you should never give into that particular segment.
All right. I'm wondering, are there any voices out there that you think are adding a productive dialogue to the discussion these days?
Well, when it comes to the NFL, I think it's really hard to be productive. I mean, I think that there are reasonable people, even on the left, who want to discuss the issue. But I think everything has been hijacked by the fringes. So really, when you're talking about the protesting and the police brutality, you're basically hearing from the fringes. But I think that there are people who really want to have a serious conversation about this. I mean, even on the right, I've heard a lot of conservatives say that they don't necessarily disagree with what Colin Kaepernick was protesting against. They just disagree with the way he did it. And I kind of find myself in that camp because I think he did more harm than good with that, regardless of what his intentions were.
Well, you tend to be a common sense guy. What do you believe to be the common sense approach to folks running wild in the streets, tearing down statues and whatnot? In other words, what do you think is the best way to handle this situation thus far?
Yeah, so I mean, we see what happened in South Carolina when Nikki Haley was governor. They had the issue with the Confederate flag. They put it to a vote. Their government voted to take it down, and that's what happened. We just saw that happen in Mississippi as well. It'll be the last state to, if they do remove it, which it looks like they're going to, they'll be the last state to have removed it. But they didn't do it by just tearing the flag down. They went through the process. So anybody who's out there tearing statues down, and especially since these people don't really care about the issue anyway, I mean, if you're tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln, then you don't really care about this issue. Those people should be locked up and thrown in prison. Like, you don't get to just vandalize public property and enforce your will through force and violence.
Well, it's interesting because just what you're talking about is what Mitch McConnell has suggested for Kentucky. He said, let's go through a process. Let's discuss this and let's take our time and not have a knee-jerk reaction. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. I mean, that's the way political discourse in America is supposed to go. I understand that there might have been times where this behavior might have been appropriate, like during the Revolutionary War, things like that. But that shouldn't be applied to every single situation. And in a situation like this, it's best to do it on the battlefield of ideas.
All right, in Missouri, we have a strange story developing over a couple in a, I guess, rather nice neighborhood who saw protesters coming. I guess it was a gated community. The gate came down. I don't know when and how, but pick up the story from there for our viewers.
Yeah, so basically there was a group of about 500 Black Lives Matter protesters, and they did break down the gate. So I definitely fault them there. They were there to protest the Democratic mayor for some misbehavior that she had gotten involved in. She had doxed some of the protesters, basically. So they were there to protest her for that. The problem is that was a private community. That wasn't a public area. So they're going through the neighborhood, and as they're walking by, this couple came out of their house, and this is a very affluent, well-to-do area. So these are like, 5-story mansions, that kind of thing. And they came out, and it was just the funniest sight to see a guy in a polo shirt and his wife. He came out with an AR-15, and his wife with her pistol. And I've never fired a handgun, but I knew that they were handling those firearms wrong. So they probably should get some training or something. And I probably wouldn't have come out on the lawn like that. But at the same time, tensions are really high right now, and the media is really ginning up racial tension. And we've seen some members of Black Lives Matter destroying property and getting violent. So they were on edge, and they had every right to be. They had every right to defend their home. They didn't shoot anybody. They didn't hurt anybody. But yet the left-wing mob still came after them online and doxed them, exposed their address, exposed their business, exposed their Yelp site where people can go on and leave reviews. They went on and left 1-star reviews, calling them racist and yada, yada, yada. They really got the raw end of the deal here, and it just became ridiculous, but it's indicative of how the left works, right? They don't just come at you with arguments. They want to destroy you, and that's what they're trying to do to this couple.
Who have you heard in the Black community that you believe is making the most sense these days?
Senator Tim Scott. Anytime that question comes up, he's my answer. I mean, there are other people too, but I mean, I'm a huge fan of Senator Tim Scott. I know he's trying to do a lot of good about, the issue of police brutality. I'm not sure how much needs to be done at the federal level, because I'm always leery of that. But I love that he has an honest voice on it. He doesn't play down racism, but he also doesn't exaggerate it. He's not afraid to talk about it in an honest way. Love the guy.
One of the things I'm concerned about, and I was talking about this earlier with our managing editor, Mark Angelides, nobody's done a count, but I wonder how many Black lives have been snuffed out as a result of this. I mean, you look at just this last weekend in the Chaz Chop Seattle thing. It's a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. Both of them are Black. I think some counting is in order here.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's why the Black Lives Matter organization does need to be held accountable. And I think that the people in that organization that are good people who I might disagree with on certain areas, those are the people I need to step up and repudiate this nonsense. Because when people do this stuff and they represent them and they're getting Black people killed, now you can't say that Black Lives Matter because you are willing to put Black lives at risk, and it's ridiculous.
Exactly. That's Liberty Nation socio-political correspondent Jeff Charles. Thanks for joining us on Truth TV today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Truth is making a comeback.
With the open admission by a co-founder of Black Lives Matter that she and her comrades are Marxists through and through, one wonders if this will cause people to turn against Black Lives Matter. From the advent of the Marxist philosophy until today, this ideology has wrought all manner of evil across the world. To say that Marxism is a failed form of government is to state the obvious, and yet so many still find it alluring. Join us today with a ton of information about real Marxism. My better half, Liberty Nation's Washington political columnist, Tim Donner. Hi, Tim, and thanks so much for joining us on Truth TV today.
Always a pleasure, Lisa.
Well, let's dig right in. What is the Marxist ideology?
Well, Marxism is essentially the ideology that serves as the underpinning of the communist political system. It all began with Karl Marx, who wrote Das Kapital, which later became known as the Communist Manifesto. That was back in 1848, before the Civil War. It essentially envisions a godless, classless society, top-down, command and control, no private property or business, no dissent, all based around ending class struggle, essentially by eliminating the rich and poor and creating a classless society, a workers' paradise.
Yeah. Well, in the 20th century, Marxist rule was, carried out in the Soviet Union and much of Eastern Europe. So how well did that work out for the people?
Well, I think we all know the story, except many of the young people who aren't being taught it in the schools about the tyranny of the 100-year march of communism. It all began in 1917 when Karl Marx's vision was finally realized in the Russian Revolution. They overthrew and executed the Tsar. And then after World War II, the Yalta Conference resulted in a division of Western Europe and Eastern Europe because the Soviets had lost many more people than we had in World War II. So they were given essentially control of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, a divided Germany, several other countries. And that form of tyranny took the Berlin Wall to contain in 1962 until it was mercifully and to much celebration torn down in 1989, and the Soviet Union itself dissolved 2 years later in 1991.
All right, so today we have China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos as Marxist states. But it doesn't seem that life has improved for these people.
No, the misery index is still very high in these remaining communist countries, a whole lot less than there were in the 20th century. China and Vietnam have tried to soften the edges by instituting reforms, of course, allowing private business to prosper while still denying political freedom. This is a very dangerous model, which says that you can have some economic freedom without political freedom. Those systems collapse in the end, Lisa, because you really can't have real freedom. You can't have political freedom or economic freedom, one without the other.
Well, then there's the sad state of Venezuela. I wanted to discuss this as a standalone because, what's happening there is just so horrible and essentially in our own backyard. I mean, first of all, would you call Venezuela a Marxist state? They seem to refer to themselves as socialists. Are we looking at a difference without a distinction?
It is a distinction and a difference, but not a whole lot of either. Because Venezuela really, Lisa, is just pure tyranny. I'm not even sure that there's any real ideological underpinning. It's just Nicolas Maduro running roughshod on a society once very prosperous that he is now absolutely destroyed with out of control totalitarian leadership. People are fleeing by the millions. Socialism, though, is being presented by those who support it as a more moderate form of Marxism, the kind you see in Denmark and much of Western Europe, which only means high unemployment perpetually and perpetual low growth in the economies, but it doesn't involve the same level of tyranny that you find in places like Cuba, where people have been willing to swim through shark-infested waters in order to escape the boot of the Castro brothers.
Finally, what do you think is the allure to communism and Marxism to the young people of today?
Well, the young people of today have not been schooled on the misery, the starvation, the deprivation, the absolute loss of anything approaching freedom in these countries. They haven't been taught that, so therefore the raw ideology first developed by Karl Marx back in 1848 is looking attractive because of it promises to make a paradise where everybody is equal and everybody is happy. And we've seen It's understandable to believe that 100 years ago, when communism and Marxism had not been tried as a form of government, but to look at what's happened, the over 100 million by any account that have died under communist rules over the last 100 years, to look at that and say that's what we want is to absolutely be in a dangerous state of denial.
Well, thanks very much. That's Liberty Nation's Washington political correspondent, Tim Donner. Read Tim's columns and insights on issues of the day on libertynation.com. And for some cleansing of your political soul, don't forget to tune into Tim's weekly radio program, appropriately titled Liberty Nation, on the Radio America Network and on fine podcast providers everywhere. Thanks so much for joining us on Truth TV today, Tim.
Thanks, Lisa. I've enjoyed it.
Truth is making a comeback.
The French impressionist Henri Matisse once said, "Creativity takes courage." And who could have imagined just how true his words would ring today? In the ever-widening effort to sanitize America from anything and everything the radical left finds offensive, a member of the cancel culture has issued a demand to remove images that depict Jesus Christ as white. But will destroying and obliterating art fix what ails race activist Shaun King and his comrades? It would be fair to say that throughout the millennia, Jesus has managed to weather a few storms, and at this latest effort by Mr. King to banish Christian iconography through the United States will amount to little more than another moment of madness. Still, such an idea on its face must be challenged on two vital fronts. One focuses on the meaning and purpose of art in our world, and the other on the theology, or lack thereof, attached to King's nonsensical demands. King's tweet reads in part, quote, "Yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should also come down. They are a form of white supremacy, always have been," unquote. Perhaps what is missing here is the most obvious theological point. Jesus is neither black nor white, but like all of us, was and is made in God's image. One does not have to dig too far into the Bible to find this truth. Genesis 1:26 reads, "God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And in verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. From Jesus of Nazareth to Jesus the Christ, none can argue but that Jesus is beyond mere depiction. Thus, Jesus is neither black nor white. But it could be said that he is both black and white, and everything in between. Arguing about the color of Jesus is an absurdity, just as debating his race. It's senseless because Jesus is Jewish through and through. So what then is the purpose of destroying stained glass images, iconography, or any art that depicts Jesus as white? Shall we desecrate Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son because the artist's eye differs from our own? Or should we simply enjoy what he put on canvas because it adds to our understanding of the biblical scene? 'Tis a sad mindset indeed that cannot embrace beauty in all its forms. One does not have to have faith to weep at the sight of the Pietà, or stand in awe of the Sistine Chapel. To reduce art created in the Spirit, by the Spirit, to a matter of race, is to remove the diversity and color that makes our world so vibrant and beautiful. A worldview that only sees in terms of the color of people's skins is precisely what civil rights activists railed against in the 20th century. Above all, people like Shaun King are to be pitied for desiring to live in a monochrome world. And that's my viewpoint for today.
Truth is making a comeback.
And that's it for another edition of Truth TV. Thanks for tuning in, and remember to look up Liberty Nation in your favorite search engine and subscribe to our Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and our new Roku channel. Remember, liberty all the time and everywhere.
Ready, set, go.
Stay ahead of the curve with libertynation.com, because we put the power of the press in your hands. With one click, Liberty Nation delivers tomorrow's news.
And remember, liberty
Today.
all the time and everywhere.
Liberty Nation connected the dots between a Chinese research biolab and a wet market where COVID-19 was supposedly discovered. 2 months before the MSM. We were first to alert you of a serious attack on gun rights in Virginia. LN honed in on the Biden-Burisma scandal months before it hit the papers. We brought you exclusive interviews from the border.
We're looking at people just rising up.
Liberty Nation was on the ground in London,
Trump rally in front of the American embassy,
bringing you on-the-scene reports about Brexit. LN reported that COVID-19 was more virulent but less deadly weeks before others. LibertyNation.com delivers tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles and a new Roku channel. Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Truth is making a comeback. Visit us at LibertyNation.com.